Blue Eagles, Red Ducks. Perhaps the most radical aspect of the New Deal was the National Industrial Recovery Act, passed in June 1933, which created a massive new bureaucracy called the National Recovery Administration. Under the NRA, most manufacturing industries were suddenly forced into government-mandated cartels. Codes that regulated prices and terms of sale briefly transformed much of the American economy into a fascist-style arrangement, while the NRA was financed by new taxes on the very industries it controlled. Some economists have estimated that the NRA boosted the cost of doing business by an average of 40%, not something a depressed economy needed for recovery. The economic impact of the NRA was immediate and powerful. In the 5 months leading up to the Act's passage, signs of recovery were evident. Factory employment and payrolls had increased by 23% and 35%, respectively. Then came the NRA, shortening hours of work, raising wages arbitrarily, and imposing other new costs on enterprise. In the 6 months after the law took effect, industrial production dropped 25%. Benjamin M. Anderson writes, "NRA was not a revival measure, it was an anti-revival measure. Through the whole of the NRA period, industrial production did not rise as high as it had been in July 1933, before NRA came in." The man Roosevelt picked to direct the NRA effort was General Hugh Iron Pants Johnson, a profane, red-faced bully and professed admirer of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Thundered Johnson, "May Almighty God have mercy on anyone who attempts to interfere with the Blue Eagle," the official symbol of the NRA, which one senator derisively referred to as the Soviet duck. Those who refused to comply with the NRA, Johnson personally threatened with public boycotts and a punch in the nose. There were, ultimately, more than 500 NRA codes, ranging from the production of lightning rods to the manufacture of corsets and brassieres, covering more than 2 million employers and 22 million workers. There were codes for the production of hair tonic, dog leashes, and even musical comedies. A New Jersey tailor named Jacob Maged was arrested and sent to jail for the crime of pressing a suit of clothes for 35 cents, rather than the NRA-inspired Tailor's Code of 40 cents. In The Roosevelt Myth, historian John T. Flynn described how the NRA's partisans sometimes conducted business. The NRA was discovering that it could not enforce its rules. Black markets grew up. Only the most violent police methods could procure enforcement. In Sidney Hillman's garment industry, the code authority employed enforcement police. They roamed through the garment district like stormtroopers. They could enter a man's factory, send him out, line up his employees, subject them to minute interrogation, take over his books on the instant. Night work was forbidden. Flying squadrons of these private coat-and-suit police went through the district at night, battering down doors with axes, looking for men who were committing the crime of sewing together a pair of pants at night. But without these harsh methods, many code authorities said there could be no compliance, because the public was not back of it. The Alphabet Commissars. Roosevelt next signed into law steep income tax increases on the higher brackets and introduced a 5% withholding tax on corporate dividends. He secured another tax increase in 1934. In fact, tax hikes became a favorite policy of Roosevelt for the next 10 years, culminating in a top income tax rate of 90%. Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan, who opposed much of the New Deal, lambasted Roosevelt's massive tax increases. A sound economy would not be restored, he said, by following the socialist model that America could lift the lower one-third up by pulling the upper two-thirds down. Vandenberg also condemned the congressional surrender to alphabet commissars, who deeply believe the American people need to be regimented by powerful overlords in order to be saved. alphabet commissars spent the public's money like it was so much bilge. They were what influential journalist and social critic Albert J. Nock had in mind when he described the New Deal as a nationwide, state-managed mobilization of inane buffoonery and aimless commotion. Roosevelt's Civil Works Administration hired actors to give free shows and librarians to catalog archives. It even paid researchers to study the history of the safety pin, hired 100 Washington workers to patrol the streets with balloons to frighten starlings away from public buildings, and put men on the public payroll to chase tumbleweeds on windy days. The CWA, when it was started in the fall of 1933, was supposed to be a short-lived jobs program. Roosevelt assured Congress in his State of the Union message that any new such program would be abolished within a year. "The federal government," said the President, "must and shall quit this business of relief. I am not willing that the vitality of our people be further stopped by the giving of cash, of market baskets, of a few bits of weekly work, cutting grass, raking leaves, or picking up papers in the public parks." Harry Hopkins was put in charge of the agency and later said, "I got $4 million at work, but for God's sake, don't ask me what they are doing." The CWA came to an end within a few months, but was replaced with another temporary relief program that evolved into the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, by 1935. It is known today as the very government program that gave rise to the new term boondoggle, because it produced a lot more than the 77,000 bridges and 116,000 buildings to which its advocates loved to point as evidence of its efficacy. With good reason, critics often referred to WPA as "we piddle around." In Kentucky, WPA workers catalogued 350 different ways to cook spinach. The agency employed 6,000 actors, though the nation's actors' union claimed only 4,500 members. Hundreds of WPA workers were used to collect campaign contributions for Democratic Party candidates. In Tennessee, WPA workers were fired if they refused to donate 2% of their wages to the incumbent governor. By 1941, only 59% of the WPA budget went to paying workers anything at all. The rest was sucked up in administration and overhead. The editors of the New Republic asked, "Has Roosevelt the moral stature to admit now that the WPA was a hasty and grandiose political gesture, that it is a wretched failure and should be abolished?" The last of the WPA's projects was not eliminated until July of 1943. Roosevelt has been lauded for his job-creating acts, such as the CWA and the WPA. Many people think that they helped relieve the Depression. What they fail to realize is that it was the rest of Roosevelt's tinkering that prolonged the Depression, and which largely prevented the jobless from finding real jobs in the first place. The stupefying roster of wasteful spending generated by these jobs programs represented a diversion of valuable resources to politically motivated and economically counterproductive purposes. A brief analogy will illustrate this point. If a thief goes house to house, robbing everyone in the neighborhood, then heads off to a nearby shopping mall to spend his ill-gotten loot, it is not assumed that because his spending stimulated the stores at the mall that he has thereby performed a national service or provided a general economic benefit. Likewise, when the government hires someone to catalog the many ways of cooking spinach, his tax-supported paycheck cannot be counted as a net increase to the economy because the wealth used to pay him was simply diverted, not created. Economists today must still battle this magical thinking every time more government spending is proposed, as if money comes not from productive citizens, but rather from the tooth fairy. An astonishing rabble of impudent nobodies. Roosevelt's haphazard economic interventions garnered credit from people who put high value on the appearance of being in charge and doing something. Meanwhile, the great majority of Americans were patient, They wanted very much to give this charismatic polio victim and former New York governor the benefit of the doubt. But Roosevelt always had his critics, and they would grow more numerous as the years groaned on. One of them was the inimitable sage of Baltimore, H.L. Mencken, who rhetorically threw everything but the kitchen sink at the president. Paul Johnson sums up Mencken's stinging but often humorous barbs this way. Mencken excelled himself in attacking the triumphant FDR, whose whiff of fraudulent collectivism filled him with genuine disgust. He was the Führer, the quack, surrounded by an astonishing rabble of impudent nobodies, a gang of half-educated pedagogues, non-constitutional lawyers, starry-eyed uplifters, and other such sorry wizards. His New Deal was a political racket, a series of stupendous, bogus miracles with its constant appeals to class, envy, and hatred, treating government as a milch cow with 125 million teats, and marked by frequent repudiation of categorical pledges. Signs of life. The American economy was soon relieved of the burdens of some of the New Deal's worst excesses when the Supreme Court outlawed the NRA in 1935 and the AAA in 1936, earning Roosevelt's eternal wrath and derision. Recognizing much of what Roosevelt did as unconstitutional, the 9 old men of the court also threw out other, more minor acts and programs which hindered recovery. Freed from the worst of the New Deal, the economy showed some signs of life. Unemployment dropped to 18% in 1935, 14% in 1936, and even lower in 1937. But by 1938, it was back up to nearly 20% as the economy slumped again. The stock market crashed nearly 50% between August 1937 and March 1938. The economic stimulus of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal had achieved a real first, a depression within a depression. Phase 4. The Wagner Act. The stage was set for the 1937-38 collapse with the passage of the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, better known as the Wagner Act, and organized labor's Magna Carta. To quote Senholz again, this law revolutionized American labor relations. It took labor disputes out of the courts of law and brought them under a newly created federal agency, the National Labor Relations Board, which became prosecutor, judge, and jury all in one. Labor union sympathizers on the board further perverted this law, which already afforded legal immunities and privileges to labor unions. The U.S. thereby abandoned a great achievement of Western civilization, equality under the law. The Wagner Act, or National Labor Relations Act, was passed in reaction to the Supreme Court's avoidance of NRA and its labor codes. It aimed at crushing all employer resistance to labor unions. Anything an employer might do in self-defense became an unfair labor practice punishable by the board. The law not only obliged employers to deal and bargain with the unions designated as the employee's representative, later board decisions also made it unlawful to resist the demands of labor union leaders. Armed with these sweeping new powers, labor unions went on a militant organizing frenzy. Threats, boycotts, strikes, seizures of plants, and widespread violence pushed productivity down sharply and unemployment up dramatically. Membership in the nation's labor unions soared. By 1941, there were 2.5 times as many Americans in unions as had been the case in 1935. Historian William E. Leuchtenberg, himself no friend of free enterprise, observed, property-minded citizens were scared by the seizure of factories, incensed when strikers interfered with the mails, vexed by the intimidation of non-unionists, and alarmed by flying squadrons of workers who marched or threatened to march from city to city. An unfriendly climate for business. From the White House, on the heels of the Wagner Act, came a thunderous barrage of insults against business. Businessmen Roosevelt fumed, were obstacles on the road to recovery. He blasted them as economic royalists and said that businessmen as a class were stupid. He followed up on the insults with a rash of new punitive measures. New strictures on the stock market were imposed. A tax on corporate retained earnings called the undistributed profits tax was levied. These soak-the-rich efforts, writes economist Robert Higgs, left little doubt that the president and his administration intended to push through Congress everything they could to extract wealth from the high-income earners responsible for making the bulk of the nation's decisions about private investment. During a period of barely 2 months during late 1937, the market for steel, a key economic barometer, plummeted from 83% of capacity to 35%. When that news emblazoned headlines, Roosevelt took an ill-timed 9-day fishing trip. The New York Herald Tribune implored him to get back to work to stem the tide of the renewed depression. What was needed, said the newspaper's editors, was a reversal of the Roosevelt policy of bitterness and hate, of setting class against class and punishing all who disagreed with him. Columnist Walter Lippmann wrote in March 1938 that, with almost no important exception, every measure he, Roosevelt, has been interested in for the past 5 months has been to reduce or discourage the production of wealth. As pointed out earlier in this essay, Herbert Hoover's own version of a New Deal had hiked the top marginal income tax rate from 24 to 63% in 1932. But he was a piker compared to his tax-happy successor. Under Roosevelt, the top rate was raised at first to 79% and then later to 90%. Economic historian Burton Folsom notes that in 1941, Roosevelt even proposed a whopping 99.5% marginal rate on all incomes over $100,000. "Why not?" he said when an advisor questioned the idea. After that confiscatory proposal failed, Roosevelt issued an executive order to tax all income over $25,000 at the astonishing rate of 100%. He also promoted the lowering of the personal exemption to only $600, a tactic that pushed most American families into paying at least some income tax for the first time. Shortly thereafter, Congress rescinded the executive order, but went along with the reduction of the personal exemption. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve again seesawed its monetary policy in the mid-1930s, first up, then down, then up sharply, through America's entry into World War II. Contributing to the economic slide of 1937 was this fact. From the summer of 1936 to the spring of 1937, the Fed doubled reserve requirements on the nation's banks. Experience has shown time and again that a roller coaster monetary policy is enough by itself to produce a roller coaster economy. Still stinging from his earlier Supreme Court defeats, Roosevelt tried in 1937 to pack the Supreme Court with a proposal to allow the president to appoint an additional justice to the court for every sitting justice who had reached the age of 70 and did not retire. Had this proposal passed, Roosevelt could have appointed 6 new justices favorable to his views, increasing the members of the court from 9 to 15. His plan failed in Congress, but the court later began rubber-stamping his policies after a number of opposing justices retired. Until Congress killed the packing scheme, however, business fears that a court sympathetic to Roosevelt's goals would endorse more of the old New Deal prevented investment and confidence from reviving. Economic historian Robert Higgs draws a close connection between the level of private investment and the course of the American economy in the 1930s. The relentless assaults of the Roosevelt administration, in both word and deed, against business, property, and free enterprise guaranteed that the capital needed to jumpstart the economy was either taxed away or forced into hiding. When FDR took America to war in 1941, he eased up on his anti-business agenda, but a great deal of the nation's capital was diverted into the war effort instead of into plant expansion or consumer goods. Not until both Roosevelt and the war were gone did investors feel confident enough to set in motion the post-war investment boom that powered the economy's return to sustained prosperity. This view gains support in these comments from one of the country's leading investors of the time, Lamotte Dupont, offered in 1937. Uncertainty rules the tax situation, the labor situation, the monetary situation, and practically every legal condition under which industry must operate. Are taxes to go higher, lower, or stay where they are? We don't know. Is labor to be union or non-union? Are we to have inflation or deflation, more government spending or less? Are new restrictions to be placed on capital, new limits on profits? It is impossible to even guess at the answers. Many modern historians tend to be reflexively anti-capitalist and distrustful of free markets. They find Roosevelt's exercise of power, constitutional or not, to be impressive and historically interesting. In surveys, a majority consistently rank FDR near the top of the list for presidential greatness, so it is likely they would disdain the notion that the New Deal was responsible for prolonging the Great Depression. But when a nationally representative poll by the American Institute of Public Opinion in the spring of 1939 asked, "Do you think the attitude of the Roosevelt administration towards business is delaying business recovery?" the American people responded, yes, by a margin of more than 2-1. The business community felt even more strongly so. In his private diary, FDR's very own Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, seemed to agree. He wrote, "We have tried spending money. We are spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. We have never made good on our promises. I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started, and an enormous debt to boot." At the end of the decade, and 12 years after the stock market crash of Black Thursday, 10 million Americans were jobless. The unemployment rate was in excess of 17%. Roosevelt had pledged in 1932 to end the crisis, but it persisted 2 presidential terms and countless interventions later. With a free enterprise. How was it that FDR was elected 4 times if his policies were deepening and prolonging an economic catastrophe? Ignorance and a willingness to give the president the benefit of the doubt explain a lot. Roosevelt beat Hoover in 1932 with promises of less government. He instead gave Americans more government, but he did so with fanfare and with fireside chats that mesmerized a desperate people. By the time they began to realize that his policies were harmful, World War II came, and people rallied around their commander-in-chief, and there was little desire to change the proverbial horse in the middle of the stream by electing someone new. Along with the Holocaust of World War II came a revival of trade with America's allies. The war's destruction of people and resources did not help the U.S. economy, but this renewed trade did. A reinflation of the nation's money supply counteracted the high costs of the New Deal, but brought with it a problem that plagues us to this day, a dollar that buys less and less in goods and services year after year. Most importantly, the Truman administration that followed Roosevelt was decidedly less eager to berate and bludgeon private investors, and as a result, those investors re-entered the economy and fueled a powerful post-war boom. The Great Depression finally ended, but it should linger in our minds today as one of the most colossal and tragic failures of government and public policy in American history. The genesis of the Great Depression lay in the irresponsible monetary and fiscal policies of the U.S. government in the late 1920s and early 1930s. These policies included a litany of political missteps: central bank mismanagement, trade-crushing tariffs, incentive-sapping taxes, mind-numbing controls on production and competition, senseless destruction of crops and cattle, and coercive labor laws, to recount just a few. It was not the free market that produced 12 years of agony. Rather, it was political bungling on a grand scale. Those who can survey the events of the 1920s and 1930s and blame free market capitalism for the economic calamity have their eyes, ears, and minds firmly closed to the facts. Changing the wrong-headed thinking that constitutes much of today's conventional wisdom about this sordid historical episode is vital to reviving faith in free markets and preserving our liberties. The nation managed to survive both Hoover's activism and Roosevelt's New Deal quackery, and now the American heritage of freedom awaits a rediscovery by a new generation of citizens. This time, we have nothing to fear but myths and misconceptions.